The first time I refused Dominic Russo's money, he looked annoyed. The second time, he looked at me like he'd finally met someone he couldn't control. Rain hammered against the diner windows hard enough to blur the neon open sign into streaks of red and blue across the glass. The overnight shift always felt longer when it rained. Maybe because fewer customers came in. Maybe because silence got louder after midnight. I wiped down the counter for the third time. Lieutenant glanced at the clock above the coffee machine. 1:17 a.m. My feet ached. My lower back felt like someone had replaced my spine with rusted metal. I'd been awake for almost 20 hours between the diner and my morning shift at the pharmacy downtown. But rent was due in 5 days. My younger sister's tuition payment had bounced that morning, and exhaustion didn't care about overdue bills. Grace? My manager called from the kitchen. If nobody comes in during the next half hour, I'm cutting you early. Fine by me, I answered, forcing a tired smile. The bell above the diner door jingled before he could reply. Cold wind swept inside first. Then the man followed. Tall, dark wool coat damp from the rain. Black dress shirt beneath it with the top button undone like he'd stopped caring about appearances sometime earlier that night. Water dripped from the ends of his dark hair onto the floor as he stepped inside. And for some reason, every sound in the diner suddenly felt quieter. He looked expensive, not flashy rich. Worse, the kind of rich that didn't need to prove itself. His eyes swept across the diner once before landing on me. Grey-blue, sharp enough to make me straighten without meaning to. "Kitchen still open?" he asked. His voice was low, controlled, like the kind of voice used to being obeyed. Another 40 minutes. He nodded once and slid into the booth near the back window. Most people sat near the front this late at night, closer to the lights, closer to safety. He picked the darkest corner in the diner without hesitation. I grabbed a menu and walked over. "Coffee?" I asked. "Black." His hands rested on the table as I set down the menu, and that's when I noticed the blood. Not much, just a streak near his cuff. My stomach tightened automatically. "You okay?" I asked before I could stop myself. His eyes lifted to mine slowly. Careful, measuring, he wasn't. Up close I could see tension around his jaw, the slight stiffness in the way he held his left arm. Not drunk, not weak, hurt. "That's bleeding through your sleeve," I said quietly. "Occupational hazard. I should let it go." Most people in Chicago learned when not to ask questions, but something about him looked familiar in a way I couldn't place. Not his face exactly. The feeling around him, like danger wrapped in expensive cologne and silence. I disappeared into the supply closet, grabbed the small first aid kit we kept under the sink, and returned before my common sense could stop me. "What are you doing?" he asked as I set it on the table. "Helping. Good thing I wasn't waiting for permission." For half a second, something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe. Then amusement, tiny, almost invisible. He slowly rolled back his sleeve enough for me to see the cut near his forearm. It wasn't deep, just messy, like he'd ignored it too long. I cleaned the blood carefully while rain rattled against the windows behind us. He watched me the entire time, not in a creepy way. Worse, focused, like I was the only thing in the room. "You always patch up strangers at 1 in the morning?" he asked. "Only the ones bleeding on my tables." That earned me the smallest exhale of laughter. I finished wrapping the bandage and stepped back. "There. Try not to punch any walls tonight." His mouth twitched slightly. "You assume it was a wall. You don't look like the kind of guy who loses fights." Silence settled between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. Somewhere in the kitchen, dishes clattered. The coffee machine hissed. Outside, thunder rolled across the city and pulled out a thick stack of cash. My eyes widened instantly. "Absolutely not," I said before he could even set it down. One dark eyebrow lifted. "It's gratitude. It's too much. That's not your concern." I pushed the money back toward him. "I helped because you were hurt, not because I wanted something." His gaze hardened slightly, not angry, more like confused. "Everyone wants something, not everyone." The diner suddenly felt too small, too warm. His eyes stayed locked on mine for so long I started noticing ridiculous things. The faint scar near his chin, the expensive silver watch beneath his cuff, the exhaustion hidden underneath all that control. Finally, "You should taken the money. You should probably finish your coffee before it gets cold." For the first time since he walked in, the corner of his mouth lifted into a real smile. Small, dangerous, unexpected. "What's your name?" he asked. "Grace." "Grace," he repeated quietly, like he was testing how it sounded. Then he stood, reaching for his coat. "Try not to bleed on my floor again," I said as he turned toward the door. He paused, looked back at me over his shoulder. And something in his expression shifted. Something unreadable. "Grace." The bell jingled softly as he disappeared into the storm. I stared after him longer than I should have. Then I looked down and realized he'd left the cash on the table anyway. Thick, heavy. More money than I made in 2 months. My heartbeat slowed, then quickened again when I noticed the note resting on top of it in clean black handwriting. "Keep it. You'll need it more than I will." I grabbed the money immediately and ran toward the door. But outside, the black SUV waiting at the curb was already disappearing into the rain. By the time my shift ended, the rain had softened into a cold mist that clung to the empty streets like smoke. I stood beneath the diner's flickering awning with the envelope in my hands, staring at the black ink of his handwriting like it might explain something that did not make sense. "Keep it. You will need it more than I will." I should have walked away. Any sane person would have. My checking account had $23 in it. My landlord had taped a second eviction warning to our apartment door 2 days earlier. My sister Emily needed another payment for her nursing program by Friday, or she would lose her spot for the semester. I needed that money. God, I needed it. But the longer I held the envelope, the heavier it felt, like it was not cash anymore, like it was a test. I shoved it into my bag and started walking toward the train station with my hood pulled tight over my head. Chicago at 2 in the morning had a lonely kind of beauty to it. Wet sidewalks reflecting streetlights, steam rising from subway grates, the distant sound of sirens somewhere downtown. Usually I liked the silence after work. Tonight it made me uneasy, because I could not stop thinking about him, the way he looked at me, calm, controlled, like a man used to everyone around him bending eventually. And maybe they did. Maybe that was why refusing him felt so strange, almost dangerous. I reached our apartment building 20 minutes later and climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor. The hallway smelled like old radiator heat and burnt coffee. Inside apartment 3B, Emily was asleep on the couch with textbooks spread across her chest and the television glowing softly in the corner. I smiled despite myself, 20 years old and still stubborn enough to study until she passed out. I draped a blanket over her shoulders, then headed into the kitchen. The overhead light buzzed faintly as I emptied my bag onto the counter. Wallet, keys, diner apron, the envelope. I stared at it for another long second before finally opening it, my breath caught immediately. $5,000. I actually laughed once under my breath because the number felt ridiculous sitting there on our chipped kitchen counter beside overdue electric bills and a cracked mug that said "World's Best Sister." $5,000 could fix everything right now. Rent, tuition, groceries. The pharmacy had cut my hours again last week. I had spent the last month pretending not to panic every time Emily mentioned school. This money could let me breathe for the first time in months. But deep down, something about taking it felt wrong. Not because he had offered it. Because of the light kindness automatically came with a price tag. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those grey-blue eyes watching me across the diner booth. The next morning, sunlight pushed weakly through the apartment blinds while Emily made coffee in the kitchen. "You look terrible," she said, tying her blonde hair into a messy ponytail. "Thank you. Your support means everything to me." She laughed softly before noticing the envelope near my elbow. "What is that? A problem?" Emily opened it before I could stop her. Her eyes widened instantly. "Grace, I know. Where did this come from?" "A customer." "What kind of customer gives $5,000? The dangerous kind," I almost said. Instead, I grabbed the envelope back and shoved it into my jacket pocket. "I am returning it." Emily looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Grace, our rent is late." I know, Emily." My voice came out sharper than I intended. She fell quiet immediately, guilt twisted in my stomach. I sighed and rubbed my forehead. I cannot keep it." "Why?" "Because accepting it felt like crossing a line I did not understand yet. Because men with eyes like his never gave something for nothing. Because part of me was afraid of what would happen if I let someone like Dominic Russo solve my problems that easily. But I could not explain any of that without sounding insane, so I just said, "Because it is not mine." Emily stared at me for a long moment before quietly returning to the coffee maker. "You are exhausting sometimes," she muttered. "Probably." 2 hours later, I stood outside a building downtown that looked more like a private museum than an office tower. Black marble, floor-to-ceiling windows, men in dark suits near the entrance who noticed everything without appearing to move at all. My stomach tightened. I stepped through the revolving doors. The lobby smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne. A woman behind the front desk looked up politely. "Can I help you?" I placed the envelope on the counter. "I need to return this to Dominic Russo." The The receptionist's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Tiny, but enough. Do you have an appointment? No. Then I am afraid Mr. Russo is unavailable. Before I could answer, a deep, familiar voice sounded behind me. Let her through. Every muscle in my body stiffened instantly. I turned slowly. Dominic stood near the elevator in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. His coat was gone now. No blood, no exhaustion. Just sharp lines, calm authority, and those same unreadable eyes fixed directly on me. The entire lobby seemed to shift around him without a single word being spoken. He glanced at the envelope in my hand once before meeting my eyes again. "You came all this way to refuse me twice?" he asked quietly. Something about the faint amusement in his voice made my pulse skip. I tightened my grip on the envelope and lifted my chin anyway. I came to return what does not belong to me. For the first time since I met him, Dominic Russo looked genuinely interested. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft metallic sound that somehow felt louder than the traffic outside. I stood beside Dominic Russo in complete silence as the private elevator carried us upward through what had to be 40 floors of polished steel and impossible wealth. My heartbeat had not slowed once since he looked at me in the lobby. Up close, he carried the same unsettling calm he had in the diner, like nothing in the world surprised him anymore, nothing except maybe me. The thought should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, it made me nervous in a completely different way. I tightened my grip on the envelope in my hands. "You know," he said finally, his voice low enough that it barely disturbed the silence, "most people would have kept the money. Most people are probably smarter than me." One corner of his mouth moved slightly. "I am beginning to notice that." The elevator opened directly into a private office larger than our entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago beneath a sky still heavy with rain clouds. Dark wood shelves lined the walls beside modern artwork that looked expensive enough to pay off student loans for half the city. Everything about the room felt controlled, precise. Even the silence seemed expensive. Dominic loosened the cuff of his watch as he crossed toward the massive black desk near the windows. "Sit," he said. "I am not staying long. That was not a request." I should have been intimidated by the way he said it. Calm, effortless. Instead, irritation sparked in my chest before fear could settle there. "You always order people around like that?" He glanced back at me over his shoulder. "Usually they listen. Maybe that is your problem." For one suspended second, the room went perfectly still. Then Dominic leaned back lightly against the edge of the desk, folding his arms as he studied me again with that same unreadable intensity. "You talk to me like I am normal. You are normal." "No, Grace." His voice softened slightly. "I am really not." The honesty in the statement caught me off guard. There was no arrogance in it, no threat, just fact. I swallowed and looked away first. That felt dangerous somehow too, like eye contact with him lasted too long. "Look," I said quietly. Placing the envelope onto his desk, "I appreciate the gesture, I do, but I cannot take $5,000 from someone I barely know." "Why?" "Because people do not hand out that kind of money without expecting something eventually." Dominic stared at me for a long moment before asking softly, "And what exactly do you think I want from you?" The question landed harder than it should have, because I did not actually know. That was the problem. Men with power always wanted something eventually. Attention, loyalty, gratitude, control. But Dominic did not look at me the way men usually did. There was something colder in him, more careful, like he was studying a puzzle he could not solve. "I do not know," I admitted honestly. "Exactly." He pushed the envelope back toward me across the desk. "Then maybe stop assuming the worst, and maybe stop trying to fix strangers with money." His eyes narrowed slightly, not angry. Interested. "You think that is what I am doing, is it not?" Dominic exhaled slowly through his nose before walking toward the windows overlooking the city. Rain streaked against the glass behind him in silver lines. "When I was 16, he said quietly, "my mother worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on in our apartment. One winter, the heat shut off for 2 weeks because she could not pay the bill." I blinked in surprise. He did not seem like someone who volunteered personal information. "A man helped us," he continued. "He paid everything anonymously. Rent, groceries, heat." His reflection remained steady in the glass. "My mother cried for an hour after she found out. Why? Because she said dignity feels complicated when survival is involved." Something inside my chest tightened unexpectedly. Dominic turned back toward me slowly. "You think I am insulting your pride. I am not." "Then what are you doing?" For the first time since I met him, his expression shifted into something dangerously close to honesty. "Trying to make your life easier." The simplicity of the answer caught me completely off guard. No manipulation, no flirtation, just truth delivered in that deep, controlled voice that always sounded like it belonged in darker rooms than this one. I hated how much that affected me. "You do not even know me," I said softly. "I know enough. You know I work in a diner. I know you are exhausted." My breath caught slightly. Dominic stepped closer slowly, his voice lowering another degree. "I know your hands shake from caffeine because you work too much and sleep too little. I know your shoes are worn down at the heels because you walk everywhere instead of replacing them. And I know you looked at $5,000 last night like it could save you." Heat rushed into my face instantly because every word was true. "You had me investigated." No, his gaze held mine steadily. I paid attention. Silence stretched between us again. Heavy this time, personal. Somewhere beneath the city below. Thunder rolled softly across Chicago. I looked down at the envelope sitting between us and hated myself a little for how badly I wanted to keep it. Dominic noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything. "Take it, Grace." His voice was quieter now, gentler. I looked back at him slowly. "People like you always say that." Something unreadable flickered through his eyes at those words. Pain maybe, or disappointment. Then it disappeared beneath control so quickly I almost imagined it. Dominic stepped back once more, placing distance between us again. "Fine." He picked up the envelope from the desk and held it out toward me one final time. "But eventually the world teaches everyone the same lesson." "What lesson?" His grey-blue eyes locked onto mine with unsettling stillness. "That refusing help becomes harder when you are desperate." I took the envelope from his hand slowly. His fingers brushed mine for less than a second. Warm, steady, dangerous for reasons I could not explain. Then I placed the envelope back down on the desk between us. "Maybe," I whispered, "but I would rather struggle than owe the wrong person." Dominic stared at me for a very long time after that, and for the first time since entering the building, I realized something that made my pulse stutter hard against my ribs. He was not offended. He was fascinated. I left Dominic Russo's office feeling like I had walked out of a thunderstorm without realizing I was already soaked. The elevator ride down felt longer than before. My pulse still refused to settle. Every word he said replayed in my head with irritating clarity. I paid attention. Most men looked at women the way people looked at paintings in expensive hotels. Pretty, temporary, replaceable. Dominic looked at me like he was trying to solve something, and somehow that unsettled me more than if he had flirted outright. Outside, the cold afternoon wind hit my face the second I stepped onto the sidewalk. Chicago traffic roared around me while people rushed past in expensive coats without noticing the strange heaviness sitting in my chest. I should have been relieved. I had returned the money. End of story. Except it did not feel finished. It felt like I had accidentally stepped into something larger than I understood. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket as I reached the train station. "Emily, please tell me you kept the money," she said immediately after I answered. "Hello to you too, Grace." I sighed and leaned against the cold tile wall near the platform. I gave it back, silence, then a long, suffering groan. "You are impossible, probably. Do you know what I could do with $5,000? Buy 27 anatomy textbooks and emotionally recover from nursing school?" Emily laughed softly despite herself. "Seriously though, what kind of man just hands someone that much money?" I stared at the subway tracks while Dominic's flashed through my mind again. Calm eyes, sharp suits, quiet control. "I do not know," I admitted, "but he is not normal, dangerous." The question settled heavily between us. "Maybe," I whispered. "Then maybe stop talking to him." I almost said I planned to. Instead, I stayed quiet because some instinct deep down already knew that was not going to happen. The diner was busier than usual that night. Rain always brought people inside searching for warmth and caffeine. My shift started at 6 and by 8 every booth was full of exhausted office workers, college students and tourists trying to escape the weather. Usually the noise helped me think less. Tonight it did not work. Every time the bell above the diner door jingled, my stupid heart reacted before my brain could catch up. By 9:30 I was annoyed with myself. Dominic Russo was not coming back. Men like him did not linger around places like this. They had penthouses and private clubs and people who probably brought them coffee without speaking unless spoken to. I was balancing 3 plates near the kitchen when the diner suddenly went quiet in the strange, subtle way rooms do before people even realize why. I looked up automatically. Dominic stood near the entrance in a dark charcoal coat with rainwater still clinging to his shoulders. The entire diner seemed smaller around him somehow. 2 men in black jackets remained near the door behind him, watching the room with professional stillness. Not security guards exactly, worse. Dominic's eyes found mine immediately. Of course they did. My stomach tightened so hard I nearly dropped a plate. Table 6 needs ketchup. My manager muttered beside me before noticing where I was staring. His expression changed instantly. Who the hell is that? Trouble, I said under my breath. Dominic crossed the diner slowly while conversations resumed in awkward fragments around him. He moved like someone completely comfortable with attention, not arrogant, certain there was a difference. He stopped beside my section, glanced at the tray in my hands, then reached out calmly before one of the plates could slide. His fingers steadied it effortlessly. "You always carry too much at once," he asked quietly. "You always appear out of nowhere, only when ignored." Heat rushed into my face immediately because somehow that sounded dangerously close to flirting. I hated that my heartbeat reacted to it. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "In a diner." One corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "You say that like food here is terrible. It is terrible. Then sit with me after your shift and suffer through it together." I stared at him in complete disbelief. Dominic looked entirely serious. "Was that a joke? I am told I make them occasionally." The soft amusement in his voice did something strange to my chest. Before I could answer, one of the older waitresses hurried past me and whispered under her breath, "Grace, why is a man who looks like he owns half the city smiling at you?" "Good question." Dominic stepped back slightly as I set the plates down at another table. When I turned again, he was already sliding into the same back booth from the night before, like he belonged there now, like this was routine. I walked over carefully with my notepad, even though I already knew what he wanted. "Coffee?" I asked. "Black." "You know caffeine is not a personality trait, right?" His eyes held mine steadily. "And refusing help is." That shut me up instantly. Dominic watched my expression soften with something almost satisfied before speaking again. "Relax, Grace. I did not come here to argue tonight." "Then why did you come?" For the first time since entering the diner, something quieter crossed his face. "Lonelier, maybe." "Because," he said carefully, "you are the first honest conversation I have had in a very long time." The answer landed somewhere deep in my chest before I could stop it, and somehow that scared me more than the money ever did. After that night, Dominic Russo started appearing in my life with terrifying consistency. Not enough to feel accidental. Not enough to feel safe either. 3 nights later, he walked into the diner exactly at 8:12 p.m., wearing another dark coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Rain clung to the shoulders again, like Chicago itself had decided he belonged to storms. The strange part was how normal it already felt seeing him there. That should have worried me more than it did. "Your boyfriend is back," my co-worker Jenna whispered while refilling sugar dispensers behind the counter. I nearly choked on air. "He is not my boyfriend." "Then why does he look at you like somebody already wrote wedding vows?" "Jenna." She grinned and disappeared into the kitchen before I could threaten her with bodily harm. Dominic was already seated in the back booth. One arm stretched across the leather seat while he read something on his phone. The men who usually followed him remained near the entrance again, quiet and watchful without ever interfering. Customers noticed them. Everyone did. People lowered their voices around Dominic without understanding why. Like the room instinctively adjusted itself around his presence. I grabbed the coffee pot and walked over before my manager could start asking questions. "You know there are actual restaurants in Chicago, right?" I asked while pouring coffee into his mug. "So I have heard. And yet you keep returning to the diner with flickering lights and suspicious pancakes." Dominic looked up slowly, grey-blue eyes calmer tonight somehow. Heat immediately crawled up my neck. I hated how easily he did that. "You need better hobbies. You are smiling." "No, I am not." "You are." Annoyingly, he was right. I looked away first and reached for my notepad. "What are you eating?" "Whatever you would recommend." "That feels reckless." "I trust you." The words landed softly between us, but my chest reacted like he had touched me, which was ridiculous. I barely knew this man. He was a mystery wrapped in expensive suits and dangerous silence, and yet every conversation with him felt strangely easy, too easy. "Fine," I muttered. "But if you hate it, I am not emotionally prepared for criticism tonight." Dominic's mouth curved slightly as I walked toward the kitchen. 10 minutes later, I returned with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and coffee so strong it could probably restart a stopped heart. Dominic studied the plate carefully before looking up at me. "This is your recommendation. Do not insult the meatloaf. It comfort food. That obvious?" "Very." He took one bite, then another. A quiet kind of surprise crossed his face. Not terrible, he admitted. Wow. High praise from a man who probably eats dinner in penthouses. Dominic set down his fork slowly. You think you know what my life looks like. I think your watch costs more than my student loans. That is fair. I laughed before I could stop myself. The sound seemed to catch his attention immediately. His gaze lingered on me long enough that my pulse started acting stupid again. What? I asked carefully. You laugh differently when you forget to be guarded. My stomach tightened unexpectedly. And you notice too much. Occupational hazard. There it was again, that invisible wall around him. Every time a conversation drifted too close to something real, Dominic slipped behind humor or silence before revealing anything dangerous. I leaned lightly against the booth. You still have not told me what you actually do. Business. That is intentionally vague. See, that sounds illegal. Dominic looked genuinely amused now. You think I am a criminal? I think men with bodyguards and $50,000 coats usually have interesting tax returns. One of his guards near the entrance coughed suddenly like he was trying not to laugh. Dominic glanced toward him once before returning his attention to me. You say things to me that other people would never say. Maybe other people are smarter than me. No. His voice lowered slightly. They are afraid. The honesty in those words settled heavily in the booth between us. I studied him more carefully then. The controlled posture, the expensive clothes, the constant awareness in his eyes like part of him never fully relaxed. Dominic Russo moved through the world like a man who expected betrayal eventually, and for the first time since meeting him, I wondered how lonely that must feel. I am not afraid of you, I admitted quietly. Something shifted in his expression again. Small, almost invisible, but real. I know, he said softly. The diner noise faded strangely around us after that. Plates clattered somewhere near the kitchen. A baby cried near the front booth. Outside, headlights smeared across wet streets beyond the windows. But for a few seconds it felt like the entire room narrowed down to the way Dominic looked at me. Calm, focused, careful. Like I mattered more than whatever waited for him outside this diner. The realization hit me all at once and hard enough to steal my breath. Dangerous men did not scare me nearly as much as dangerous men being gentle. 3 weeks after Dominic Russo first walked into my diner bleeding through a black dress shirt, I made the mistake of searching his name online. It happened at 1:30 in the morning after another double shift when exhaustion lowered my common sense just enough to let curiosity win. Emily was asleep at the apartment. Rain tapped softly against the windows while my laptop balanced on my knees beside a cup of cold coffee. Dominic Russo. The search results appeared instantly. Real estate investor, business owner, philanthropist. Articles about luxury hotels, charity foundations, political fundraisers, in expensive suits beside senators and CEOs beneath bright camera flashes. He looked exactly the same in every photo, calm, controlled, untouchable, but there were other articles too, smaller ones. Rumors buried beneath business headlines, whispers about organized crime connections, illegal gambling investigations that somehow disappeared, competitors who mysteriously sold entire companies overnight after public disputes with him. Nothing concrete, nothing provable, just enough smoke to suggest fire somewhere underneath. I stared at the screen while a cold feeling settled into my stomach. I told you he was rich. Emily mumbled sleepily from the couch without opening her eyes. You did not mention possible Mafia connections. That woke her up immediately. Possible what? Emily squinted at the article for 3 seconds before sitting upright so fast the blanket fell onto the floor. Grace, I know. Grace, I know. She ran both hands through her hair while staring at Dominic's picture like he might climb through the screen personally. Why does your life suddenly sound like a Netflix documentary? I should have laughed. Instead, I kept staring at his eyes in the photograph. Even through a screen, they carried the same intensity they did in person. Do you think it is true? Emily asked quietly. I thought about the bodyguards, the expensive office, the way entire rooms shifted around him before he even spoke. Yes, I admitted softly. Silence settled over the apartment after that, heavy, uneasy. Emily crossed her arms tightly. You need to stop seeing him. I am not seeing him. Grace, he eats meatloaf at my diner sometimes. Mobsters also eat meatloaf, apparently. I rubbed my forehead with one hand. I do not even know what this is. That is exactly the problem. Deep down, part of me already understood she was right. Dominic unsettled me in ways I could not explain. Not because I thought he would hurt me. Strangely, I never felt unsafe around him. The dangerous part was how easy it felt to forget he belonged to another world entirely, a world built on power and secrets and consequences people like me could not survive. The next evening, I almost convinced myself he would not show up again, which was ridiculous because by now some embarrassing part of me had started expecting him. 8:12, exactly like always. The diner bell jingled softly and there he was, dark coat, calm eyes. Rainwater glistening faintly against black wool beneath the neon lights. My stomach betrayed me instantly. Dominic noticed too. Of course he did. "You look concerned," he said quietly after sliding into the booth. "You look predictable." One eyebrow lifted slightly. Is that criticism? Maybe. I poured his coffee carefully while trying not to stare at him differently now that I knew, or suspected. "Long day?" he asked. "Long internet search?" Dominic went completely still for half a second. Tiny, barely noticeable. But I caught it anyway. "And what did the internet say about me?" There it was. Calm voice, controlled expression. But underneath it, something sharpened carefully. I set down the coffee pot slowly. "That depends which article." Dominic leaned back against the booth without breaking eye contact. "Interesting answer. You could just tell me the truth. About who you really are." Silence stretched between us while rain rattled softly against the diner windows. Around us, dishes clinked and customers talked and life continued normally while my pulse climbed higher with every second Dominic remained quiet. Finally, he asked softly, "Would it change the way you look at me?" Maybe. His jaw tightened slightly at that. Then maybe I should lie. The honesty in the answer hit harder than denial would have. I stared at him carefully. "That is not exactly comforting." Dominic looked down briefly at the black coffee between his hands before meeting my eyes again. "Grace, there are parts of my life that are complicated. Complicated usually means dangerous. Sometimes that is not reassuring either." A faint shadow of amusement touched his expression despite the tension underneath it. "You ask difficult questions. You give suspicious answers." Dominic exhaled quietly through his nose before speaking again. "I own businesses, some legal, some less simple than others." That sounds extremely illegal. "Probably because you watch too many crime documentaries." I should have smiled. Instead, I watched him carefully across the booth and realized something unsettling. Dominic was being honest with me, maybe not fully, but more honest than someone like him probably ever needed to be. "Why tell me any of this?" I asked quietly. His eyes held mine with that same dangerous steadiness that always made the room feel smaller somehow. "Because," he said softly, "you are one of the only people left who still speaks to me like I am human." My chest tightened painfully at the words. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere across the city, while neon lights reflected against the rain-streaked windows behind him. And sitting there across from Dominic Russo, I realized the scariest thing was not that he might actually be dangerous. It was that part of me already cared anyway. The first time I saw Dominic Russo angry, he never raised his voice. That was what made it frightening. It happened on a Thursday night during the dinner rush. Every booth in the diner was packed. The coffee machines hissed non-stop, and somebody's toddler had been crying near the front entrance for almost 20 straight minutes. My feet hurt so badly I could feel my heartbeat in my ankles. Dominic sat in his usual booth near the back window, dark coat folded beside him while he worked quietly on his phone between sips of black coffee. Over the past few weeks, his presence in the diner had become strangely routine. Customers whispered about him. Coworkers stared when they thought he was not looking. My manager suddenly started pretending coffee mattered whenever Dominic walked in, and somehow, despite every warning sign in my brain, I had started relaxing around him, which was probably the stupidest decision of my life. "Grace." I looked up from balancing a tray of fries to see Dominic watching me carefully across the diner. "You forgot to eat again today." My stomach betrayed me immediately by growling loud enough for him to hear. His mouth twitched faintly. "Traitor," I muttered under my breath toward my own body. "How do you even know that? You get quieter when you are hungry." I stared at him for a second too long. Nobody noticed things like that, not unless they paid attention constantly. Before I could answer, the diner bell jingled sharply, and 3 men walked inside laughing too loudly for the small room, mid-30s maybe, expensive jackets, the kind of confidence alcohol usually borrowed for people. I noticed Dominic glanced toward the entrance once before calmly returning to his coffee. But something in his posture shifted slightly, alert now. One of the men slid into a booth near my section, while another leaned against the counter scrolling through his phone. The third kept staring at me in a way that instantly made my shoulders tighten. I grabbed menus anyway and forced a polite smile. "What can I get started for you guys? You on the menu?" the tallest one asked with a grin. I ignored it automatically. Women learned early which comments deserved energy and which ones deserved survival. "Coffee?" I repeated evenly. "How about your number instead?" His friends laughed. My exhaustion thinned the last strand of patience I had left. How about pancakes and emotional growth? The booth behind them went completely silent. I realized too late Dominic had heard every word. The man across from me leaned back with a smirk. Cute, thank you. You always this friendly only to customers making bad decisions. One of his friends laughed harder while the tall guy's expression tightened slightly. Relax, sweetheart, we are joking. Then maybe tell funnier jokes. I turned to walk away before the situation could become more uncomfortable. That was when the man reached out suddenly and grabbed my wrist, not painfully, but enough to stop me cold. The entire diner changed instantly. Silence spread through the room so fast it felt physical. My pulse stumbled hard in my chest. Then I heard Dominic's voice behind me. Calm, quiet, controlled, let her go. Every hair on my arms rose immediately. The man holding my wrist glanced toward Dominic with visible annoyance. Mind your business. Dominic stood slowly from the booth. No dramatic movement. No threat. Somehow that made it worse. The two men who usually stayed near the entrance straightened immediately. One hand moved subtly toward his jacket before stopping when Dominic barely shook his head once. You are in my city, Dominic said softly. Sitting in my diner. Speaking to someone under my protection, my breath caught instantly. Under my protection, the words wrapped around me with dangerous warmth. The man laughed once without humor. Protection? Who the hell are you supposed to be? Dominic took exactly one step closer. Expression unreadable. Someone giving you an opportunity to leave politely. The room felt colder suddenly. Not because Dominic sounded angry, because he did not. The man released my wrist slowly, but his bravado had started slipping around the edges now. He glanced around the diner like he finally realized nobody else was speaking. Nobody else was moving either. Dominic Russo carried the kind of silence that made people nervous without understanding why. Whatever, the man muttered eventually, standing from the booth. Crazy waitress anyway. Dominic's gaze never left him. Leave. They did. Fast. The bell above the diner door slammed loudly behind them as cold air rushed inside for a brief second before silence settled again. My manager immediately pretended to reorganize receipts near the register while every customer in the diner avoided looking directly at Dominic. Like instinct told them not to. I stared at him across the room while my heartbeat slowly returned to normal. Dominic looked back at me calmly, then nodded once toward the kitchen. Take 5 minutes, he said quietly. You are shaking. I looked down. He was right. My fingers trembled slightly around the notepad still clutched in my hand. You did not have to do that. Dominic's expression softened almost invisibly. Yes, he said carefully, I did. Something in the way he looked at me then made my chest ache unexpectedly. Not ownership, not obsession, worse, concern. Real concern from a man the internet called dangerous. And standing there beneath flickering diner lights with my pulse still racing, I realized something terrifying. Part of me had never felt safer than when Dominic Russo said my name like it mattered. After Dominic called me someone under his protection, I stopped sleeping properly. It sounded ridiculous even inside my own head. I was a 26-year-old waitress sharing a tiny apartment with her younger sister, not the heroine in some dramatic crime movie. Normal people should have heard those words and immediately run in the opposite direction. Instead, I kept replaying them in my mind while trying to understand why they made my chest feel warm instead of afraid. That was the dangerous part about Dominic Russo. He never pushed, entitled to my attention. Somehow that made him harder to resist. A week passed before I saw him again outside the diner. Friday night, cold wind whipping through downtown Chicago hard enough to sting my face. My shift ended just after midnight, and the streets glistened silver beneath streetlights after another evening of rain. I stepped outside, pulling my coat tighter around myself when a familiar black SUV rolled quietly to the curb across the street. My stomach immediately betrayed me. Dominic stepped out seconds later, dressed in a charcoal coat with his hands tucked calmly into his pockets. He looked unfairly composed for a man standing in freezing weather after midnight. That is becoming creepy, I called across the sidewalk. Dominic's mouth curved faintly. You noticed me quickly. You drive a vehicle large enough to invade small countries. He crossed toward me slowly while traffic hissed through wet streets behind him. You should not walk home alone this late. Chicago has trains. Chicago also has people. You say that like humanity is a design flaw. Frequently, I laughed softly before I could stop myself. Dominic watched the sound happen again with that same quiet focus that always made me feel strangely visible. Come eat with me, he said suddenly. Dominic, you have not eaten since noon. I blinked. Are you secretly tracking my meals? You get headaches when you skip food. That does not answer the question. Annoyingly, it was. I rubbed my forehead automatically because the dull ache behind my eyes had been building for hours. Dominic noticed the movement immediately. Of course he did. 20 minutes, he said gently. Then I will bring you home. You sound very confident, I am agreeing. You are exhausted, Grace, not irrational. The scary thing was how easy it felt saying yes to him now. Maybe because Dominic never made me feel trapped. Maybe because somewhere between coffee refills and quiet conversations, I had started seeing the loneliness underneath all his control. Fine, I muttered finally. But if you take me somewhere that serves tiny decorative food portions, I am leaving. Dominic opened the SUV door for me with suspicious calm. I will keep your emotional needs in mind. The drive downtown felt strangely peaceful. Soft jazz played quietly through the speakers while city lights reflected against rain-streaked windows. Dominic drove himself tonight. No bodyguards, no tense men watching every doorway. Just him beside me in dark clothes, with one hand resting loosely against the steering wheel. Human, that almost felt more dangerous somehow. So where are we going? I asked. A diner. I stared at him. You are joking. You said no decorative food. You already spend every night in my diner. That one belongs to you. The answer came so naturally that my pulse skipped before I could stop it. Dominic pulled into a quiet 24-hour diner overlooking the river. Older place. Warm yellow lights glowing against fogged windows. The kind of restaurant where nobody rushed you out after coffee. We slid into a booth near the back while an older waitress greeted Dominic by name. My eyebrows lifted immediately. You have a regular diner? Everyone needs one honest place in the world. The waitress brought coffee without asking. Dominic watched me wrap both hands around the mug like warmth alone could keep exhaustion from reaching my bones. You work too much, he said quietly. You notice too much. I worry. The word landed softly between us, honest, unprotected. I looked up slowly. Dominic held my gaze without hesitation. No games, no charm. Just truth sitting there beneath dim diner lights at 1 in the morning. My chest tightened painfully around it. Nobody worries about me like that, I admitted before thinking. Something shifted in his expression immediately. Careful sadness, maybe. They should. Silence settled around us while snow began drifting softly outside the windows. First snowfall of the year. Chicago looked softer beneath it somehow, less sharp around the edges. Tell me something real, Dominic said quietly after a while. What? Something nobody else knows. I smiled faintly against the coffee mug. That sounds dangerous. Maybe I am tired of conversations that mean nothing. I studied him carefully across the booth. The internet called him ruthless, powerful, untouchable. But sitting here tonight, Dominic Russo looked tired in a way money could not fix. Okay, I whispered finally. When my parents died, I stopped believing people stayed. Dominic went completely still. I stared down at the coffee while forcing myself to continue. Everybody leaves eventually. Jobs, relationships, safety. So I learned not to need too much from anyone. Quiet stretched uncomfortable. Then Dominic spoke softly enough that I almost missed it. That explains why you keep refusing things. My throat tightened unexpectedly. Maybe, Grace. I looked up slowly. Snow drifted behind him beyond the diner windows, while soft jazz played somewhere near the counter. Dominic's grey-blue eyes held mine with terrifying gentleness. I think, he said carefully, you deserve people who stay anyway. And sitting there across from a man I should have feared, I realized my heart had already started doing something much more dangerous than fear. The first gift Dominic Russo ever gave me was not money. It was silence. Real silence. The kind that wraps around your ribs after months of surviving noise, bills, stress, exhaustion, fear. 2 days after our late-night diner conversation, I came home from a double shift expecting another eviction notice taped to our apartment door. Instead, I found the hallway quiet for once. No shouting from the neighbors downstairs, no broken elevator alarm buzzing endlessly through the building. Just silence and the faint smell of fresh paint. I frowned immediately. Our landlord had not fixed anything in years. Inside the apartment, Emily sat frozen at the kitchen table staring at a sheet of paper like it might explode. Why do you look like you saw a ghost? I asked carefully. She looked up slowly. Grace, that is usually my name, yes. The landlord stopped by. Every muscle in my body tightened instantly. What happened? Emily handed me the paper with slightly shaking fingers. It was a receipt. Rent paid, 3 moves. My heartbeat stopped completely for one terrible second. No, I whispered immediately. No. Emily stood quickly from the table. Grace, maybe somebody finally felt sorry for us. Nobody feels sorry for people for 3 months straight. I already knew. Deep down I knew before I even reached for my phone. Dominic answered on the second ring. You sound upset, he said calmly. Did you pay my rent? Silence, tiny, barely there, but enough. Dominic, your building owner was planning to raise prices next month, he said quietly. Now he is not. My chest tightened so hard it hurt. You promised no more money. I promised no strings attached. That is not better. Emily watched my face carefully from across the kitchen while I paced toward the apartment window. Snow drifted softly outside beneath grey Chicago skies. You cannot keep doing this, I whispered. Dominic's voice stayed infuriatingly calm. Doing what? Maybe I am trying to ease it. Without asking me, you would have said no. Exactly. Silence settled heavily between us again. Then Dominic spoke softer this time, more honest. Grace, I watched you work 16 hours straight last week while pretending you were not exhausted enough to collapse. My throat tightened unexpectedly. That is not your responsibility. Maybe I want it to be. The words hit somewhere deep and dangerous inside my chest. I closed my eyes briefly because hearing Dominic Russo say something that gentle should not have affected me this much. You cannot buy your way into people's lives, I said quietly. I am beginning to understand that. Then why do this? Dominic exhaled slowly through the phone. Because helping you feels more important to me than being obeyed. That completely stole my ability to speak for several seconds. Emily mouthed, "What is happening?" from the kitchen table while I stared helplessly out the apartment window. I did not know. That was the terrifying part. Nothing about Dominic felt simple anymore. Not his attention, not his kindness. Not the way he somehow made protection feel dangerously close to affection. I am still angry with you, I managed eventually. I know, and returning the money this time is impossible, also true. You are unbelievably frustrating. A quiet laugh sounded through the phone, warm, real. It did strange things to my heartbeat. You should rest tonight, Dominic said gently. That is not changing the subject. No, he replied softly. It is me caring about you anyway, after we hung up. I stayed near the apartment window for a long time at snow gathering along the fire escapes across the street. Emily approached carefully. So, she said slowly, the emotionally unavailable billionaire mobster paid our rent. Please do not call him that. Interesting that you defended billionaire before mobster. I groaned softly and dropped onto the couch. Emily sat beside me immediately. Grace, what? You like him? I absolutely do not. She gave me a look. You smile every time your phone lights up now. That is not evidence. You also stopped complaining about your night shifts because he visits the diner, Emily, and you are defending a man who apparently terrifies landlords into becoming charitable. I opened my mouth to argue again before realizing I had no argument left, because somewhere between late-night coffee and quiet conversations, Dominic Russo had stopped feeling like a stranger. That should have scared me more. Instead, the scariest part was realizing how safe his attention had started to feel. 3 nights later, I walked into the diner for another shift and froze immediately. Dominic sat in his usual booth near the window, but tonight he was not alone. A silver-haired man in an expensive navy coat sat across from him speaking quietly while 2 guards lingered nearby. The older man noticed me first. His eyes sharpened with immediate interest before sliding toward Dominic. "So that is her," he said calmly. Every instinct in my body tightened at once. Dominic looked over his shoulder slowly. The second his eyes found mine, his entire expression softened in a way I had never seen before, and somehow that frightened me more than anything else.